I'd like to welcome you all to the launch of the Partnership for American Democracy. We're about to hear from a group of extraordinary leaders across political parties, sectors, and American life. We believe that we are at an inflection point. What we do to stop further decline, to secure and strengthen our democracy, will matter now and for generations to come. Creating and launching this powerful partnership is the result of the contributions of many people. In particular, thanks to the remarkable John Bridgeland and also Nick Penniman, both of whom were instrumental from the very beginning. Jeff Kutash and a great advisory group created the momentum and handed it off to the fabulous Alan Casey. All along, we had help from Unite Crew and especially my exceptional colleague, Molly Bauman. Thank you to the more than 65 organizations that have already joined our partnership and an extraordinary group of Americans who comprise the National Leadership Council. All along the way, there were many organizations that encouraged and supported us. And none of this would have been possible without our initial funders, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Walmart Foundation, Skoll Foundation, Pure Edge, and Issue One. Thank you. I come to this work with a childhood memory of living in a profoundly undemocratic country. South Africa pretended to have a democracy, but excluded 96% of the population from participating in the elections. Once settled in the United States, I joined the anti-apartheid movement, intent on clearing the way for a democratic government. Prior to his election as president, I had the honor of meeting Nelson Mandela on his first trip to the United States. He implored me to come home and help build our democracy. Little did I know then how relevant that exhortation would be to the current state of our American Democratic Republic. For some years now, organizations have stepped up mightily to tackle these growing challenges, yet so many have been limited by insufficient capacity to fulfill their missions. There are also numerous organizations, companies, institutions, and individuals whose primary focus is elsewhere, yet they now express deep worries about our democracy, and it is not obvious to them how and where to make a difference. That is why the partnership is being created to provide a clear single point of entry for all who want to become part of the solution. It will act as a collaborative nerve center to attract and direct greater attention, energy, and resources to existing and new efforts to reinvigorate our republic. By working across strategic and related areas of democratic focus, the partnership intends to galvanize public support with a unified message and gather supporters from across the spectrum to move the needle on democratic renewal. Now, we have identified 5 strategic pillars of democratic engagement around which we are partnering to craft powerful, sustainable democracy goals timed with the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence in 2026. You will hear from leaders in each of these areas, which we intend to pursue with an unrelenting commitment to equity and inclusion. The first pillar is civic education, because our democracy is stronger when all high school students graduate with the skills, knowledge, and disposition to become engaged citizens. Our second is national service and engagement, because our democracy is stronger when many of us, especially young people, serve our communities and one another. Our third, bridging divides, because our democracy is stronger when we see each other's humanity beyond politics and ideology. Our fourth, advancing government reforms, because our democracy is stronger when voting is accessible and secure, when congressional districts are fairly drawn, and when big money doesn't dominate policymaking. And our fifth, combating mis and disinformation, because our democracy is stronger when high-quality journalism sets the public debate and we can all agree on a common set of facts. Our work will rely and build on the recommendations of the report titled Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century, which promises a roadmap to strengthen our democracy. We all know that democracy isn't a static condition, but an everlasting march. Let's march together as partners and renew the promise for generations to come. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Alexandra Nguyen, a second-generation Vietnamese American who is this year's National Youth Poet Laureate of the United States and soon to be a freshman at Stanford University. Welcome, Alexandra.
Love poem for the end of the world. Should the end of the world come, tell them we've already seen it. The traffic parted and the people went indoors and everything became very blue, which could be a reference to our screens, I suppose, but I more mean the film on my tongue, the lacing of my shoulders. I think I heard the opposite of an echo, sitting down inside of myself for the 4th time last week. I keep thinking too slow. I keep trying to say my name, but they're static. I keep tripping on the step stools, which I think is supposed to ground me, and what better way to fly than to have done it by accident? Because that's all this is. As everything else came unstuck, I realized we were the reason for all this living, so should the end of the world come, tell them we're not scared. You see, worlds end all the time. This moment is a world, this poem a world, and there will be infinitely many after it. The sun is just a burning body, but it makes this here, this seeing your face possible. How wondrous it is that we have memory to weave these stars into constellations, that we can choose to unthread all the blindfolds that bind up our nation. There is a pattern. We burn into the night sky, and we alone can make it beautiful. So listen now, while our hands are still raw with magic. Hold all that you can. Build something, break it down, then build again. Let the voices of our people lay the foundation like mosaic, our fragments not an emblem of our fragility, but our ability to reclaim what it means to be whole. To honor all of the land and lives this system stole, let the ash give way to a kind of freedom that is immortal and indivisible from the community's soul. Let every way of being become sacred in our promise to the people, underlined in bold, so hold all that you can. Build something, break it down, then build again, and when you finally look up, smile at the people standing beside you. Thank you.
And now, historian Doris Kearns-Goodwin.
Hi, everyone. I am so glad to be with all of you today to celebrate the birth of the Partnership for American Democracy. This birth could not come at a more critical moment in the history of our continuing struggle to maintain our democratic experiment. But let me open with history's reminder that we've been through really, really tough times before, and each time we've emerged with greater strength. Just imagine the anxiety and fear in the early days of the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln warned that if the Union did not hold, it would prove that democracy itself was absurd. If those who lost an election, he said, as the South did in 1860, had simply had the right to break up the government in response, then it would show that elections were meaningless, that the people could not govern themselves. Or just imagine what it was like at the turn of the 20th century, when industrialization had shaken up the economy, much like globalization and the tech revolution have done today, when a menacing gap had developed between rich and poor, big companies swallowing up small companies, people in the West distrusting those in the East, people in rural areas feeling cut off from city dwellers, when it was widely believed that democracy itself was under attack. And then just imagine what it was like in the spring of 1933, when the Depression had hit rock bottom as FDR took office. 1 of 4 were out of work. Millions had lost their homes and farms. There was no safety net. Soup kitchens were running out of food. The banks had collapsed, taking depositors' funds with them. FDR was told if the New Deal succeeded, he'd be one of the greatest presidents in history. If the New Deal failed, however, he'd go down as the worst. No, he said, if we fail, I'll be the last president. Democracy itself is on trial. And we know what the people living in those eras did not know. We know the end of their story. We know the Union was restored and emancipation secured. We know that Theodore Roosevelt's square deal broke up big companies not playing by the rules of the game and softened the worst aspects of the industrial order. We know FDR's New Deal carried the people through the Depression until the mobilization for war brought the economy back. So today, as we are living in this anxious time when democracy is once again under threat, it is up to us to write the next chapter of our story. And that is what is so encouraging to me about the birth of this new partnership of citizen activists. History tells us that transforming change comes from the ground up, from citizens taking action. When Lincoln was called a liberator after the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, "Don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery movement and the Union soldiers that did it all." It was the progressive movement in the cities and states before Theodore Roosevelt, the Settlement House movement, the social gospel movement, that formed the foundation of his square deal. It was the foot soldiers in the civil rights movement that made possible the passage of 3 great civil rights laws under Lyndon Johnson. And then, of course, we've had the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the climate change movement. Theodore Roosevelt warned that the greatest threat to democracy would come if people in different classes and parties and regions began regarding each other as the other, rather than as common American citizens, so caught off from each other that neither appreciated the other's passions or points of view. Such is the situation of American democracy today, and this is precisely why the pillars of this new partnership hold such great promise: civics education, national service, bridging cultural and political divides, combating disinformation, and renewing trust in government. And what grounds this new enterprise is the willingness to set tangible goals, to target milestones by 2026, the 250th anniversary of our nation's birth. FDR long believed that goals fire the imagination of the American people. In March of 1933, as the government set to work on creating the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, FDR set a goal of having 250,000 young men in the camps by July. He was told he was crazy, but he forged ahead, breaking down silos in government, putting Labor Department in charge of enrolling the young men, the Interior Department designing the work projects in the forests, and the Army constructing the camps, transporting, feeding, and clothing the men. It was the most rapid mobilization in the history of the country, and by July 4th of that same year, 250,000 men were at work in the forests, cutting dead shrubs, planting new trees, clearing paths, enjoying the dignity of work, most never having set foot before in a forest. FDR believed that problems created by man could be solved by man, and today we would say people to include us all. And indeed, it is up to all of us now, which is the spirit animating the launch of this partnership. Some might say it's crazy to set a goal of having 1 million young people in national service by 2026. It would mean 1/4 of those who turn 18, a generation that is our best hope to be able to bridge divides, develop fellow feeling as people from the country come to the city and vice versa, to set our democracy on a stronger path. What a splendid goal, what a splendid vision this is, to leave our cynicism behind and come to this challenge with fresh eyes and a whole heart. How good it feels for all of us to be together today. Hooray!
It is a pleasure to join you in reaffirming our commitment to the world's oldest democracy. Movements of democratic renewal begin from the ground up and should transcend politics and division. And the Partnership for American Democracy embodies those principles. You are calling upon all Americans and our institutions to take part in the great work of civic restoration. And your effort is coming at just the right moment. In many ways, this is a solemn time for our country. Recent events have revealed an atmosphere of social distrust that turns easily toward violence. Some view politics as the equivalent of war, in which opponents are enemies and only one side can ultimately win. Some have abandoned persuasion in favor of intimidation. And some, in politics and in the partisan media, seek their own benefit by feeding this deep alienation from the promise of America. It would be a mistake to dismiss the real needs and concerns that often lie behind political discontent. It is the hard fact of our history that the practice of American democracy has often been unequal to the grandeur of American ideals. But the most important matter is how we choose to respond. Do we lose faith in the fairness and legitimacy of our constitutional order and try to act around it? Or do we affirm the American faith even more ferociously and apply its protections more consistently? We know the choice that great Americans have made. Abraham Lincoln talked at Gettysburg about a new birth of freedom and a government of, by, and for the people. Franklin Roosevelt tied victory in a world war to the triumph of 4 freedoms. Martin Luther King Jr. responded to the brutality of segregation with an incandescent affirmation of the Declaration of Independence. And when King fell to the forces of hatred, Robert Kennedy responded by calling for love and wisdom and compassion toward one another. All of us here today know the decision that America must make. With so many forces in our society trying to pull us apart, it is urgent that all Americans find even greater sources of unity. With so many voices raised in anger and resentment, it has never been more important to speak words of healing. With so many people engaged in demonization and dehumanization, America needs the countervailing influence of common effort and common purpose. So it is my privilege to support the Partnership for American Democracy and to endorse its sustainable democracy goals. You are defining the practical steps that Americans can take if they want to form a more perfect union, establish justice, and ensure domestic tranquility. To affirm American ideals, citizens must be educated to know them. So history and civics education are fundamental. To build greater unity, Americans need civic rites of passage, including a year of national service to bring people together across differences to solve public problems. This would cultivate a generation of leaders who can transcend politics, race, ethnicity, and income to get things done and to heal our differences. To encourage the grassroots strengths of democracy, we need to accelerate the growth of a new generation of bridge-building organizations that engage diverse people in shared community work. To ensure an informed citizenry and accountable government, we must strengthen local journalism and find effective ways to deepen the trust that all Americans have in a common set of facts and in combating misinformation and disinformation. To inspire a new generation of political engagement and leadership, we must ensure that our political system is fair, transparent, and open to all. To this point, Americans have lacked a single place to go if they want to join the work of democratic renewal. That is the challenge you are meeting today. This effort will allow everyone of every background and skill to find their role, their place in this great movement of conscience. That is the reason that I support the Partnership for Democracy and applaud its launch today. It captures the sense of American possibility, represents the best of us as a people, and shows what we can achieve when we act together. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Judy Woodruff with the PBS NewsHour, and I'm so pleased to be part of this program today. This next segment has been titled Restoring the Soul of America, The View from the Oval Office. And joining us now is Bruce Reed, who is the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, one of President Biden's closest confidants. And just a word of introduction, Bruce was Chief of Staff when now President Biden was Vice President. He is one of his longest serving aides, someone who not only understands the president's policy vision, but he also knows him as a person. So Bruce, we are so glad to have you join us. First of all, tell us, how does this president see the meaning of democracy? In a way, I can't believe I'm asking you this question, but how does he see what democracy means in 2021?
Well, thanks, Judy, and thanks to everyone in the partnership who's part of this launch. For the president and for all of us, strengthening democracy is hard, constant work, and this is a crucial moment for it. I guess the best description he's given is, as he told Congress in April in his joint session remarks, that our country's just been through the worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. And this is the moment when we have to prove to the world and to ourselves that democracy still works, that it can still deliver for our people. He talks often about how high the stakes are and how, as he said in Europe earlier this summer, we're in a contest with autocratic governments around the world to demonstrate that democracies can get our act together and compete to win the future.
So, Bruce, when you look at the mission of the partnership and what it's trying to do, how does the president see what he's doing does intersect with what the partnership is doing?
Well, as you pointed out at the top, the president has often said these last 2 years that we have to restore the soul of America and unite the country. And it's great to see so many dedicated people from different walks of life come together across party lines to do just that. We need to build bridges, literally and figuratively. We need to strengthen our core democratic institutions. We need strong civic education that teaches our children the values and ideals and institutions of democracy. We need to make clear that voting and other forms of civic participation are important. And we need to set big, bold, ambitious goals, as this endeavor is doing. As Joe Biden likes to say, this is the United States of America. There's nothing we can't do when we put our minds to it and do it together.
I think it's natural to ask you a question on the day when the U.S. Supreme Court rules and upholds restrictive voting laws in the state of Arizona, how the president sees, how can he push through in an environment when there are restrictions like what we are seeing, not just in Arizona, but in Georgia and a number of other states?
Well, this is a travesty what's going on in some states around the country. He's going to be continuing to fight as hard as he can to, kind of preserve the most important pivotal right of our democracy, which is the right to vote. He's planning to speak out on it again next week. I think it's we've seen what the stakes are when we see kind of callous disregard for the Constitution and for the norms that have held us together this long. And it's really important for every American to understand that they have a chance to vote, they have a right to vote, that when they do vote, their vote is counted, and when their vote is counted, that the result counts and stands.
And Bruce, in terms of how the partnership can move this agenda forward, what's the most important thing you would look to the partnership to do in coming years?
Well, I think one of the great things that the partnership is set up to do is it challenged Americans to kind of summon their better angels and do their part. As I said, we've seen how fragile democracy can be, but this isn't the first time that democracy has been tested. The president likes to point out that back in the 30s, Franklin Roosevelt, at a similar time when we were facing a similar choice between democracy and autocracy, FDR united the nation by reminding us that in America, we do our part, that we all do our part. And the president believes that Americans are once again ready to answer that call. And we're grateful to everyone involved in the partnership for doing your part and inspiring all Americans to do theirs.
I should say, as we thank you, Bruce Reed, I'm just now reading a news bulletin. The president is telling reporters in South Florida that he's deeply disappointed in the Supreme Court's decision. Bruce Reed, Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Judy.
And now we're going to move to a segment that's been titled Bipartisan Action for All of America. And we have two important guests for that conversation. Deval Patrick was the governor of the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I should say, from 2007 to 2015. And Dirk Kempthorne has served our country as the Secretary of the Interior from 2006 to 2009. He was the governor of Idaho from 1999 to 2006, and he was also U.S. Senator from the state of Idaho from 1993 to 1999. So he has served in all of these capacities. I want to welcome both of you and just say by way of preface that although these two American leaders are from different parties, they've been serving together as the co-chairs of the COVID Collaborative, of the leading national bipartisan assembly for the past year, working to bring American leaders, institutions, and sectors together to combat COVID-19. So I just want to start by asking the two of you about that experience, working together. Again, you represent two different political parties, but you've been able to combine forces at this moment of national testing. How have you done that, Governor Patrick?
Well, I think I'd start by saying, first of all, Dirk makes it easy. The COVID Collaborative confirmed that you don't have to agree on everything before you can work together on anything. And when America faces big challenges, love of country demands that leaders seek out and join with others to find solutions. And I think it was in that spirit, and I think Dirk would agree, that we mobilize leaders in public health and medicine, education, business, nonprofits, and groups ranging from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the NAACP and others. Everyone stepped up, and we are much the better for it. I mean, for example, we teamed up with the Ad Council on a $50 million vaccination education campaign, and it was linked to associations who would help us reach and inform people from all sorts of backgrounds about the importance of getting the vaccination for your own safety and for the safety of others. Our schools initiative linked top health experts with thousands of educators and superintendents on strategies to keep students and staff alike safe. And we've been in regular touch with governors, and since the new administration comes in, with the White House in their weekly briefing on their national COVID response plan. So it's a classic public-private partnership, and it's worked. And the American public, I'd finally say, the American public has its differences. But I think I'm confirmed in my view that those differences are a lot less deep than the drama displayed by American politicians. I think our own experience in independent surveys repeatedly show that.
And Governor Kempthorne, what about from your perspective of having worked together with Governor Patrick and the whole team who's been working with you on the collaborative? I mean, what has it been like, not only working on this crucial set of issues, but again, working across party lines to get it done?
Judy, thank you. I could not have a stronger partner and friend in this whole effort than Deval Patrick. So many times when we exchange comments, views, we share messages, we do town hall meetings across the country, I am inspired by what he says. It resonates. When we talk about our differences, the important thing is, as you know, Judy, those differences are actually assets, because there are resources and organizations that Deval can reach out to in touch that I cannot, but I can do the same on our side. Right. And I found that when we started making calls to different organizations, just as Deval had mentioned, whether it's the U.S. Chamber, the Business Roundtable, National Association of Manufacturers, UNIDOS, the National Congress of American Indians, and say, would you like to join forces in defeating a virus that is killing us? First, they expressed their frustration, which was not happening, but then the enthusiasm of saying, absolutely, let's work together. And suddenly, all the rhetoric was put aside and we started achieving results. That's what the people were hungry for. And as you begin to have those positive results, boy, it just continues to propel this forward. So my concluding thought on that is the American spirit of Americans willing to work together is still alive and well.
It's so interesting to hear both of you say this, and I just want to bring it to a present context, Governor Patrick, because this morning the PBS NewsHour, NPR, and the Marist polling organization released a poll that shows Americans are divided in their views of COVID, and much of it is along partisan lines. So is this something that Governor Patrick became clear to you in your work? And is it something that you feel you need to work through, or is it just a fact of life?
Well, look, I guess I'd say never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined we could politicize a public health emergency. We did that. Politicians did that. Partisan interests did that. And it's not beyond our capacity to care about or to solve. We're not imprisoned by it. The virus kills and hurts regardless of party, regardless of region, regardless of station in life, and we all have a stake in beating it. There are conflicts or differences in approach, but denial is not it's not a strategy. And I think as we got down to it, when you weren't asking people essentially to answer those kinds of survey questions as a Republican or a Democrat, but you're just asking them to answer questions and respond to issues as a father or mother, as a neighbor, as a leader, you get much more constructive and I think constructive contributions and much more effective action.
And Governor Kempthorne, what is your take on that? Is this just something that's a fact of life? How does it affect your ability to get the message out about the COVID?
Judy, when you look at all that data, which we've poured through, and you realize that absolutely the different segments of our society, whether it's based on political affiliation, ethnicity, where they live, but they then express how they are truly feeling. And for example, when Deval mentioned that $50 million ad council, that was not to do just one big national message. No, we broke it down into the local level so that you had assets that were brought to bear, whether it's your local minister, whether it's a priest, whether it is your pharmacist, and we bring it to people in their own neighborhoods so that they can express what are their concerns and fears. As a father of two, grandfather of five, I hear the different views from my kids and their outlook for their children. But one of the things I believe in are the young people in this country. And again, because of the approach of this COVID collaborative, nationwide, nobody's seen the multitude of coalition members like we have with this one, where we're actually achieving results and keeping in mind the sensitivity of the individuals and answer their sensitivities, not a broad brush, get it right down to what their concerns are.
So let's, in our few minutes left, bring this back to what this program is all about today. Governor Patrick, and that is, of course, the Partnership for American Democracy.
Yes.
Why did you want to be part of this, and what do you hope it's going to achieve?
Well, I do think our democracy is in jeopardy for some of the reasons that the speakers before have said, but I also think it's worth saving. It's worth fighting for and caring about. And one of the strategies that I'm especially excited about is this notion of expanded service. When I was governor, we launched something called Project 351, which was about bringing an 8th grader from every one of the Commonwealth's 351 cities and towns together for community leadership and community service, that is, in leadership development. And 10 years later, that program is still going strong, and it's producing optimistic, caring, pragmatic, effective leaders across Massachusetts. I want to see that same kind of thing across the country. And when I think about the healing we need as a divided nation, I think about national service. For one thing, it gives people, young, old, and in between, a chance to help meet the country's unmet needs in programs like Teach for America, City Year, Conservation Corps, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, even in the military, for Pete's sake. And at the same time, it gives people a chance to do meaningful work alongside others who may be different from them, from different parts of the country, different political backgrounds, different faiths, different life experiences, so that you learn to push through the kind of one-dimensional cartoon view we so often traffic in this country, and see the human being on the other side of it.
And finally, Governor Kempthorne, what would you add to that? What do you want to see come from this partnership's work?
You'd add affirm first and foremost the power of democracy, and the only way that it works is by participation of its citizens. And I have seen that just a couple of years ago. I was asked to address 125 university and college presidents, student body presidents, and I wasn't sure what I was going to be walking into. It was the most respectful, sincere, compassionate group of young people I've encountered. That's what's taking place across our campuses. We have true leaders, and we have people that believe in the country. I would add to that, and Deval mentions national service. I too believe in that. I've been part of that. I know that General Stan McChrystal will be speaking shortly, but maybe I can give you this footnote. It's to allow all Americans, if they wish to serve their country, to do so, and they need not necessarily wear the uniform of the United States. But last night we had 6 of the members of the USS Idaho, a ship that we're fortunate, a Navy ship named for our state, the commanding officer, and 5 members of the crew. While they patrol the seas of the world to protect our form of democracy, does it not make sense that we owe it to them also that we fulfill the destiny and the potential of democracy by carrying it out and making sure that the discourse, that we can get to have the civility, and that we can listen to one another, and again, put the rhetoric aside and let's get the results. We owe it to one another in this democratic, beautiful republic of the United States of America.
With that, I want to thank both of you so much, Governor Kempthorne, Governor Patrick. Thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Judy.
And our segment now is titled Coming Together in Common Purpose, the urgency of the Partnership for American Democracy. And with us are 3 distinguished Americans who are going to be part of this conversation, starting with Stephen Heinz, who has served as the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund since 2001 for the past 20 years. He was the first philanthropist to take an early bet on the Partnership for American Democracy, leading to this moment today. He also oversaw the development of the Our Common Purpose report that inspired it. Also joining us for this conversation, General Stanley McChrystal, one of America's most celebrated military leaders, is the former commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. In addition to holding many other key military roles, he's also chairman of the Service Year Alliance. And finally, Janet Marguia. Marguia is the current president and CEO of Unidos US, one of the leading Hispanic advocacy organizations in the United States, and one of the most outspoken civil rights activists in the country, respected universally by all sides. I want to thank all 3 of you for being with us. And I want to kick it off with Stephen Heinz. I mentioned how you played an important role in the partnership since its beginning. You also played a very critical role in another organization, the commission that was created, Our Common Purpose, created by the Academy of Arts and Sciences, which I had the privilege of serving on. But tell us from your perspective, Stephen Heinz, about that work and how it informs, you think, what the partnership is trying to do.
Well, thank you very much, Judy. It's a pleasure to be here today with so many truly outstanding American leaders for the launch of this partnership. And I'm especially glad to be on this panel with Janet Marguia and General McChrystal, 2 people I admire very, very deeply. So, as you said, I've had the privilege to serve as co-chair of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship. And after 2 years of research and deliberations and debate, we issued our report, which is called Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. And we issued it about a year ago. And I'm just delighted that this report has helped inspire the launch of this partnership. You know, as we conducted our work over those 2 years, I think the single most important input to our deliberations came from listening sessions we held in nearly 50 communities all across the country. We heard the views of rural community leaders in Indiana, Somali immigrant women in Minnesota, first-year midshipmen at the US Naval Academy, conservative thought leaders in Mississippi, seminary students in New York City, municipal employees in California, and the list just goes on. We asked Americans in these listening sessions about their experiences participating in our democracy today, their frustrations, their fears, and their hopes. And in every session, literally every session, people expressed their deep concern that our democracy simply isn't working for them. They feel that their voices don't matter. Americans are tired of our divisions, of our antagonisms, of our destructive civic antipathy. But we also heard, as Governor Patrick mentioned earlier, a universal love of country and a profound hunger for a sense of common purpose and for a functioning system of democratic self-government that welcomes participation from all and actually solves big problems. So our report offers 31 specific recommendations, some of them quite bold and will be debated and are being debated, that address reforms of political institutions and processes, the democratic strengthening of our civil society, and the necessity of a vibrant and healthy civic culture that inspires faith in our constitutional democracy and one another. You know, this is a moment, a turning point in American history, as Doris Kearns Goodwin said earlier. It calls on us to reinvent our democracy for the challenges of this century, like the pandemic, like climate change, like racial justice, and on and on and on. And it requires leadership from all sectors of society, working in partnership with grassroots movements and citizens across the country. And that is why this partnership is so important.
And we are so grateful for your perspective, Stephen Heinz. Janet Murguia, as we mentioned, you lead UNIDOS, which serves millions of Latinos, Hispanics in this country, Americans, and you serve, your focus is in the area of civic engagement, civil rights and immigration, education, workforce and the economy, health and housing. From your perspective and from the work you do, why does America need this partnership and the work it is trying to do? Why does it need it from a standpoint of the need for us to be more inclusive, to be a country that is fair to all Americans and serves all Americans?
Well, thank you, Judy. It's a real honor to be part of this panel with Stephen and General McChrystal as well, people I deeply admire, and you. Look, I think it's important for us to recognize that as a country, we are diverse and we have many population groups that have grown. Demographically, we're changing. It's really important for us to signal the importance of inclusion. And we agree that at Unidos US, we have to prioritize coming together and unity. In fact, it's one of the reasons we changed our name. We used to be the National Council of Raza, but with this young cohort of our own community, it's very important for us to stress inclusion within our own community. We're not a monolithic group. And so we wanted to signal it's important for our community to come together and invite others to join us in advancing the interests, not just of Hispanic Americans, but of all of us, and in breaking down barriers that preclude that inclusion and opportunity. So I think it's important to say that we do believe that putting the country first in terms of its interests and not political gain from either side is going to be the most important. when you look at the polls, there is consensus among the American people on a host of issues and on the need to focus on solutions, not gridlock. We're committed to doing that, but we have to include the voice of all of those who are part of this country. On that point, I would say that it's important to achieve a healthy democracy. And if we do that, we can't continue to allow for the demonization of people who have lived and contributed to this country. Demonization and hate have had a serious and even deadly consequences, but it's also corrosive to our democracy. And we can't come together if we see people who disagree with us as evil or the enemy. It's up to all of us, most prominently our elected officials, to condemn extremist rhetoric and behavior. Turning a blind eye to hate is costing us and our democracy dearly, and often at the cost of demonization of a cohort of Americans that are going to be essential to the success of America's economy and democracy. Finally, I just would say, Judy, it's so important for us to make sure that all those who live in this country have the ability and the desire to participate in our democracy. And that means protecting and expanding the right to vote and facilitate, not obstruct that right. We too were extremely disappointed with today's Supreme Court decision. We need to restore faith and trust in our American institutions and defend and preserve the institutions that work to better our democracy in our country. So we are proud of the work that our affiliate network does to promote onboarding new Americans, but also creating those opportunities for everyone, including the Latino community, to show that it has been important part of the history of this country, but will be an even more important part of the future of this country. But we need that opportunity and to do that and to break down barriers that would cause those problems for us to not be full contributors.
Janet Murguia, thank you very much for that response. I want to bring in now our third panelist. He is General Stan McChrystal. And General McChrystal, as we mentioned a moment ago, you lead and you co-founded the Service Year Alliance. You've challenged this country to make a year of national service a common expectation and opportunity for all young Americans as a way to strengthen our democracy. Tell us why this is something you are so passionate about and why you think it has the effect that you believe it does on our democracy.
Judy, thank you. And I'm humbled to be on here today in this collection and to listen to the friends and people I admire speak before me. I think national service is critical because I think America depends upon the vibrancy of our citizenship. If I want to be a good athlete, I have to work out. If I want to have a good sports team, we have to practice. If I want to have a good military unit on the battlefield, we have to train. We have to train hard. And democracy's hard. And so I think we've got to train ourselves and our future citizens. We've got to give opportunities for people to interact across the range, the incredible diversity of our population, get to know people who aren't from your zip code, don't have your religion, don't have your economic background, and do the kind of service that in ages past, like the Second World War, people were forced together by circumstances. Now we've got to bring ourselves together by intentional effort to bring young people together, give them a formative experience, which also lets them invest in the country because we value what we invest in. It's going to be hard work to do this, but if we are going to have the kind of country we believe we want to have, it takes work. And I think national service is the needed vehicle to let us do that.
So interesting to hear you describe it. My late colleague, Jim Lehrer, who I believe you knew, was also passionate about national service. It's one of the issues that he felt, even as a journalist, that he could speak out about and speak about regularly, which he did. Stephen Heinz, I want to come back to you, and I have one more question for each one of you in this segment. But the question I have now is, what role do you see philanthropy playing in this effort to renew and strengthen our democracy?
Well, I guess I would start by just underscoring that democracy is not inevitable. It's a choice, and it requires continuous engagement. And I think for too long, many of us have taken our democracy for granted, and this has contributed to the crisis that we are facing today. And American philanthropy, I think, in all honesty, shares some of the blame in this story of neglect. The data is telling. If you examine the decade leading up to 2020, only 2% of the grant dollars of American philanthropy was spent on democracy reform in the kind of broadest sense of that term. Now, obviously, philanthropic dollars are not going to save our democracy, but they are an important component of the efforts to advance reform, to engage Americans in their communities, and to draw attention to things that work to strengthen our democracy. Philanthropy, I think, can help reverse the spiral of decline through interlocking efforts to design responsive and representative institutions, knit together civil society and strengthen local communities, and build bridges across the painful divides that cleave our political culture today. And, we're now seeing some encouraging signs. Foundations and individual philanthropists are coming to see that democracy is worth fighting for, not least because it is the fight that will determine all the others, as Ezra Klein has written. If we are to survive climate change, create a 21st century education system, advance racial justice, and accomplish our other big goals, we just simply have to have an inclusive, effective, and resilient democracy. I think back to de Tocqueville, who said that the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. And we are at a moment when all of us, including American philanthropy, must join in this effort once again to repair the faults in our democracy.
Thank you, Stephen Heitz. And I'm getting the signal from our organizers that I need to move along, and so I'm now required to ask Janet and General McChrystal to give me an answer in less than a minute each. But Janet, you're so familiar with this. It's going to be easy for you to do. You've got 300 affiliates across this country. What do we need to do to ensure that there's a strong grassroots movement to strengthen democracy?
Thanks, Judy. Look, our network is actually a great example of how grassroots organizations are working on investing in the renewal of American democracy. More than 3/4 of our affiliates provide English and citizenship classes. They're the ones, along with other nonprofits, doing the heavy lifting in terms of fully integrating immigrants, onboarding these new Americans into our society. This is important, but not sustainable without the support of philanthropy. I think you've touched on a really important point. Think about Andrew Carnegie. In some ways, I think Mackenzie Scott is the Andrew Carnegie of this century, because just like Carnegie, he understood the importance of investing in libraries across this country. Those libraries, along with nonprofits that emerged to settle many of these immigrants, became instrumental in developing the society as we see it fully evolved today. So I do think that our affiliates, these nonprofits across the country, rooted in communities, because of their proximity, can be essential when supported to helping on civic engagement, to helping with various programs that can help strengthen us as a society. So I do believe that there are literally millions of Americans, including Hispanics, who are eager to serve and be participants in the society. The nonprofit sector, especially at the local level, can be essential in doing that.
Janet Murguia, thank you very much. And General McChrystal, you're going to get the last word with the last question. And that is, we know that President Biden has framed much of what we're dealing with today as a contest, if you will, between democracy around the world and authoritarianism. How do you see that in efforts in this country to strengthen democracy? And connected to that, how do you see the role of the military, the U.S. military, in playing a role?
Well, to keep it brief, every military member takes an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. To make it simpler, we make a promise to the American people that we will defend the ideas of democracy, not fall prey to an authoritarian leader. And that's what the military's got to represent and stay true to.
And you did keep it brief, and we know there's a lot more to say about that. And I know we'll have opportunities to hear that in the future. General Stanley McChrystal, thank you. Janet Murguia, thank you so much. And Stephen Heinz, we appreciate it. All three of you, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Judy, for that excellent conversation. And now I'm very happy to introduce myself. My name is Elena Treen. I am a congressional reporter at Axios, and I am joined by three former congressmen, very successful at that, Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, Congressman Zach Wamp, and former Majority Leader Dick Gephardt. Thank you all so much for being here. And I think your insights today will be, so important because not only did you have a front seat to a lot of democracy, but you were helping make it work during your time in office. And I think one of the first questions I want to ask you is about the polarization we're seeing, among all across America, but within Washington and among parties right now, far much more than what we saw when you were in office. I'd like to start with you, Congressman Wamp, just about, how it differs from when you were in office and how you see maybe we can bridge the divide.
So, Elena, thank you for doing this. And to Leader Gephardt and Congresswoman Comstock, it's a privilege to continue working with you to restore confidence and functionality in our government. It's a sad moment, frankly, and I'm encouraged that people are working to try to fix it all. There are a lot of reasons, Elena. I just want to mention a few which kind of tee up our conversation here. One is the iPhone. Two is 24/7, what we used to call news, what I would call propaganda, frankly, on both sides. I want to talk about misinformation and disinformation, which are potentially the greatest domestic threats I think we have in this country today. And then just basic civics education. We now have people rising to the highest levels of government. I had civics in the 8th grade. A lot of people are now in high positions of power who've never had civics. They don't even understand the basics. So if you got misinformation, disinformation, the ability for anybody with the iPhone to communicate to millions of people things that are false, we have a big problem because there's no baseline of truth. So we have to have shared values. We have to have expectations and norms that we all agree to, a baseline being truth. If we're all working from truth, we have a chance of working together. But if more and more people don't know what's true and you have the ability to communicate it, we have major problems. So the polarization is like on steroids today.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a very good point. And I know for myself as a journalist, we try to do our best to fight against that. But you're right. And we hear it from all different sides. And we saw a lot of this, I think, spike during the past administration. And it's still so today. A lot around, we were just talking previously before all of our viewers joined us about the January 6th commission. I think that's kind of emblematic of some of the partisanship that we're seeing, just how far apart Democrats and Republicans are on this. Congresswoman Comstock, I'd love to go to you. I know you had some great thoughts on that right before this panel began.
Sure. Well, I do think, even though it's, there's obviously tools for people to use to get more information out, it still comes down to, the content of the character of the people who are in office. And so I was a staffer, and then I was in an administration as a staffer also. So Capitol Hill staffer, then a staffer before I was in Congress. And when I look at some of the members who are there today and the kind of just outright lies that they tell on a regular basis, and I will say this does happen on both sides, it's sort of a character of people that we never had back in the day. I worked for Congressman Frank Wolf, who was a very conservative Republican. I was there when Leader Gephardt, led his party. the kind of things that are said today, Congressman Wolf and Congressman Gephardt never would have been saying in the 90s, and Zach, I think that's true too. So I think often when what people want to blame sort of all the outside things, I do think it comes down to a lot of the people we're electing, and then the American people themselves. What type of people are they electing? And when you have such an easy ability now, because of everything online, to provably, show things are false. People will, you saw what you saw on January 6th. There's more detail on that than anybody had about 9/11 or say the shooting of JFK. Yet there's more disinformation, and that is driven by individuals and politics. And unfortunately, people who aren't willing to stand up and just say what you've seen is what you've seen. And I think that we have brave ones like, say, Brad Raffensperger down in Georgia. There was a state senator in Michigan who just came out with a report pointing out that there wasn't false information there. I am heartened by, I do think these few people with courage and character, particularly on the Republican side, I think will turn things. But I think we have to put it on the people, not all the extraneous things.
It's a very good point, Congressman. And Congressman Gephardt, I'd love to, ask you about how we bridge that gap. So we heard President Biden throughout his campaign trail and continuing in now that he's in office to talk about unity and wanting to reach across the aisle, something that's very hard to do in the makeup of, a 50-50 Senate and a very slight Democratic majority in the House. I'm curious what you think, how the different parties can come together and if they can moving forward.
Well, I'm optimistic that they can. I've been working, as I know Zach and Barbara have, with the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. They had a major role to play in pulling together this bipartisan infrastructure bill, and I'm really in admiration of what they've done. Now, getting it all done in the end is going to be real hard work on everybody's part, including President Biden's part, because you're in this polarized atmosphere that we're in. If the people are polarized, Congress will be polarized. Congress reflects the American people, and that's part of the problem we're facing. But having said that, I think the vast majority of Americans want bipartisanship. They want their government to function and work, and they want a good future. And they're rooting for all the people in Congress and President Biden to get things like the infrastructure bill done so we have a brighter future in the country. So I'm optimistic. Maybe it's easy to get depressed about all this, and from time to time I get down about it. But there's some really good people in Congress today in both parties that are really struggling to try to get things done that need to be done.
Mm-hmm. All great points.
And you've got to fight off the far left and the far right, which is always important in both parties. And you've got to try to keep people talking to one another and listening to one another. And that's the secret. Democracy is always really hard. It was really hard when we were there, and it's even harder today. That's the nature of the beast. As Churchill said, it's the worst form of government on earth except for all the others. And he was exactly right. So we got to make this work. If we don't, people are going to give up on it and go to plan B, which is the authoritarian model. Nobody's going to like that.
Well, I think people have to realize that sometimes, that often, and actually I think usually, the loudest voices on either side are not the majority. Mm-hmm. And that's what gets mistaken and promoted. You have this sort of celebrity culture of people who just want to be on TV, and they aren't the ones getting legislation done. Matt Gaetz is not someone who's negotiating any bill. Chances are people don't want to be near him. The same thing with Ilhan Omar. You're not going to see legislation passed by her. So you have these people who like to be on TV, be incendiary. They unfortunately do raise a lot of money because the fringes can drive money. But where the work gets done are those people who are sitting down and understanding that you got to get that 50+1, and you got to have, and also reach out to the people. And I agree with Leader Gephardt that the majority of Americans do want to have that done. So it requires courage from people on both sides to break through that. And I think that's a lot of why Joe Biden, who I disagree with probably on a lot of issues, but I think he was elected because people saw him as somebody who wanted to work together. And just today, you saw him with his hand on Ron DeSantis down in Florida saying, we're going to work together on this catastrophe down there with the building collapse. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Donald Trump was incapable of doing. And it'll probably drive people on both sides. I looked a little at Twitter, and on both sides, they're like, oh no, they're working together. Oh no, what's going to happen? What's going to happen are people who are in need are going to be helped. And that's what you're supposed to be there to do.
Mm-hmm. These are all amazing points. And I agree with you, Congresswoman. I think a lot of the times the people on the far right and the far left have the loudest voices. And so that's why they get a lot of coverage. But you're right. I don't think that they're the ones, I know that they're not the ones walking the halls of Congress every day that are driving a lot of the policy. I guess one question to follow up on that is about, I know how a lot of members feel and what they say behind closed doors, and a lot of leaders and our elected leaders. But sometimes for politics' sake, and playing politics is part of what we do. That's why perhaps sometimes I think democracy fails. Would you agree with that? I'll give it to you, Congressman Wong.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I think we have an obligation, though, former members, to weigh in support of like problem solvers and braver angels and people who are really working to try to bring everyone together, because we do still have a voice. And we have to empower them and give them courage. The word encourage means to give them courage. There's not enough people on both sides today, especially on the Republican side, that have enough courage to put their country above their party. And we need to encourage the groups that are doing that, and then we'll have a chance. So I know we're running out of time, Elena, but I appreciate this brief moment for us to come together, Democrats and Republicans, and say, if we don't work together, this form of government doesn't end up surviving.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up a good point. I know we are running out of time, but you're all here for a reason. Why do you think this partnership, the Partnership for American Democracy, is so valuable? And I'll go to you, Leader Gephardt.
Well, everybody that's involved in it just loves this country and loves this democracy and loves the opportunities that they and their families have been afforded by being citizens of this greatest democracy in the history of the world. I grew up poor in St. Louis. My parents had nothing. Neither of my parents went to high school. I got to go to college and law school. And they never mentioned it to me. I had a grade school teacher who said, I think you can get a scholarship to go to Northwestern University. Until she had talked to me, it had never entered my head. This is a great country. There's no other country in the world where a kid can have an experience like that. So we've got to preserve this. We have to preserve. And if the three of us and a number of others that are involved in this have anything to say about it, we're going to preserve it.
Amen.
And it's such a privilege to be able to serve. And the great thing is, from that privilege of serving, I served in the state government and in Congress, and then as a staffer before all of that, it helps you, the reason I'm involved, and I know a lot of others, it helps you both support and encourage those who are already there, but also let people, give hope to people that this is a system that can still work. And it doesn't even require a majority of the people to embrace it. It just requires a few people with courage to kind of stand up in this moment and make it work. And I do think we are going to see that, because I think you are seeing the men and the women. It's like, my friend Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, I think those are two heroes who really are standing up at a moment when they're very needed. And I think history will reward them. And I think their example will inspire others.
Well, very well said, Congresswoman. Unfortunately, it went too fast and we're out of time, but I want to thank you each so much for your time here today, Congresswoman Comstock, former Majority Leader Gephardt, and Congressman Wong. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you.
An effective democracy is critical to everything we do as a nation. You know, we're not fulfilling our promise as a country. We're the nation that sent the first man to the moon, won 2 world wars, developed the Marshall Plan, created a more inclusive and welcoming society for millions of people. And yet in recent years, we've seen unexpected threats to our democracy and some of the lowest levels of trust in our key institutions, including government.
We cannot wait for somebody else to come and fix things. We have to do it ourselves. And the good news is we have the power to change things.
Everyone is wringing their hands about what do we need to do. Well, here comes the Partnership for American Democracy.
We are bringing together the people who work in all of the areas of democracy that really matter. That includes civic education, service and learning and volunteering. It includes bridging the divide. It includes political and other kinds of governmental reform.
Is such a moonshot for democratic renewal, with clear, sustainable democracy goals, plans to meet them, visions for quality implementation, and accountability for results as we look to the 250th anniversary of the signing of our Declaration of Independence.
People do hold the power if they're empowered to participate, if they're enfranchised, if they exercise their suffrage. And that's the idea. You only broaden the public square by bringing people on the margins on the inside.
The time is now for each of us to step forward, to join in common pursuit, not just in defense of our democracy as it was created, but in the commitment to building the democracy we can become. Join the Partnership for American Democracy.
Hello, everybody. It's so great to be with you for this launch. My name is Eric Liu. I'm the CEO of Citizen University, and I am proud to be involved in the Partnership for American Democracy in many ways. I am one of the co-chairs of the Civics Pillar, and I've just been a collaborator and a partner in crime in the emergence of this remarkable network, and just seeing all the folks in chat, many of whom are friends and colleagues, and many of whom are new to me. It's just incredible to feel the energy that's attending this launch. We're going to spend this next chunk here in this segment really focusing, after we've been hearing so much about the challenges and opportunities facing our democracy right now, we're going to spend time now diving deep in the partnership itself, why it matters right now, and what our theory of action is for how we together can really remedy some of the ills and challenges that we've been naming thus far in today's session. And what I want to just say before I introduce our panelists for this session is just to emphasize something that my friend and colleague Stephen Heinz in an earlier session really said, which was that democracy is not inevitable. There's nothing given about the way in which we get to govern ourselves. It requires constant cultivation, the way a garden requires constant cultivation. And another way that I like to think about this is that democracy works only if enough of us believe democracy works. Which is to say that laws, policies, constitutions are important, but what animates those kinds of documents, what animates the letter of our law is the spirit, and our spirit of commitment and our willingness to engage each other across all the lines that we've been talking about today and demonstrating in these previous sessions. And so it's that spirit of collaboration, of courageous engagement across different divides that is so fundamental right now to this endeavor. And our panelists embody that spirit better than just about anybody I know. And I want to just introduce them briefly, and then we're going to have each of them speak in turn about the work of their respective pillars. So first, representing the civic education pillar of this work at the partnership is Louise Dubé, who's the executive director of iCivics. Next, Phil Ann Tree, who is a two-time AmeriCorps member and the Core Network's 2012 Core Member of the Year, representing the National Service pillar of the partnership's work. And she chairs the Native American Parent Advisory Committee for the Flagstaff Unified School District in Arizona. Next, we have Manu Meal, who is the CEO of Bridge USA, and here with us today as one of the co-chairs of the Bridge Building pillar. And Bridge USA is an innovative organization that's harnessing the power of young people to cross political divides and build a stronger, healthier political culture on college campuses. Next, we'll hear from Nick Penniman, who's the founder and CEO of Issue One, and he represents the effective governance pillar. He has led bipartisan efforts around the country to pass reforms in our political system and to help secure American democracy in the coming decades. And then last, but very much not least, Frank Sesno, representing the pillar that's strengthening local journalism and combating misinformation and disinformation. Frank hardly needs any introduction. We know his name and face from CNN, where he spent many years as Washington bureau chief, and he's now director of strategic initiatives at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. And I want to just review before I actually turn it over to Louise and the other panelists here, these 5 pillars: civic education, national service, bridge building, effective governance, strengthening local journalism / combating mis and disinformation. These pillars are not just buckets of subject matter. The theory of action of the Partnership for American Democracy is that actually pillar may not even be the right, pillar may be too impermeable a metaphor, that these are all parts of an ecosystem. And that you can't have effective governance unless you have bridge building. And you can't do bridge building well unless you have strong civic learning. And you can't have strong civic learning unless you've got a vibrant local journalism ecosystem. And you can't have that kind of ecosystem of local commitment unless you've got a culture of national service in ways that people show up for each other in community. That all these things feed one another in ways that will strengthen our democracy. So that's the framework of the Partnership for American Democracy. And to tell us a little bit more about each of the pillars, let me turn it over first to Louise to talk about civic education.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you for elevating the importance of civic spirit, which is so incredibly important at this time. I'm delighted to be here to represent the Strengthening Civic Education pillar on behalf of so many of my colleagues who are doing the hard work of civic education every day in the field with schools and students. Civic education is ready for this moment. We know we need to partner with others to make the case that civic education can be a solution to help sustain our constitutional democracy. As many of you have alluded to, self-government needs all of us. Young people need to build the muscle for it. That includes civic knowledge and how our system works. That includes the civic skills to engage in it. And that includes the civic disposition to do so civilly, particularly with people they disagree with. That's the hard work of democracy. They also need the opportunities to exercise the muscles through service learning and other experiences. Unfortunately, over decades, we've disinvested in civic education. For example, at the national level, we spend $50 per student per year on STEM education. That's a great investment, but we spend 5 cents on civic education. And we have the results to show for it. Only 24% of students are proficient in civics. It is possible to reverse this trend. So over the last 2 years, I worked with 300 colleagues, educators, students, parents, experts, to lay out all of the critical questions that students must encounter in their K-12 history and civic education to graduate with that muscle for constitutional democracy. The result is the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, and it is a path forward. We've proved with hard work that we can find common ground even in our polarized country, and we've laid out a plan to achieve excellence. Now is the time to put that plan into action. So what are we going to do? One of the first things we need to do is to pass the bipartisan, co-sponsored Federal Civics Secures Democracy Act. It calls for $1 billion of investment in history and civics. Very important. Another is to work with districts, schools, students to implement the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. We're excited to join forces with the partnership to get to work to make excellence in civics a reality in every school and every community. This kind of change can only happen if we're deeply committed to it. We know that our democracy is in peril, but our resolve to act is greater. So thank you so much, and we're excited to get going. Back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Louise, so much. And now let me turn it over to Phil-Ann Tree, who's going to speak to us about the national service pillar of the partnership's work.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm co-chairing the service pillar, and in my service experience, I was able to weatherize homes on the Navajo reservation for families. A majority of these households are without running water and or electricity, and that's due to ancient federal Indian policy that have been on the books for decades. A lot of the crew members we were able to hire were very overqualified for the living stipend provided, but then due to the unemployment rates in both tribal and rural communities, they saw it as an opportunity to turn the tables of being a charity recipient and step up to be a service provider. And I really think that's very important in these AmeriCorps programs, the bridging that goes on, not just between people and communities and cultures, but the bridging that goes on for opportunities. And in my experience, in reflecting on it, I think the example that really demonstrates this the most is when we are able to go and have the honor of working on a Navajo World War II code talker's house. And that was just an eye-opening experience from everybody that was involved. And when you think about it, that's an AmeriCorps member that's serving a war hero. And if that doesn't speak to what the service in this country needs to look like now moving forward, I don't know what does. And in moving forward, there's a couple of things that we're getting behind. The first being the Civilian Climate Corps that's being sponsored by our president, Mr. Biden. And that's going to ramp up and put an additional 100,000 young people doing a lot of the work that similar to what I just spoke about. And then the other one is also getting behind the Bipartisan Court Act, and that is being also sponsored by both Senators Coons as well as Wickers. And in addition to that, it has a lot of co-sponsors that are also bipartisan, about 15 of them. And in moving forward, this is what we need to see as a unified movement for a unified vision, especially with the service in our country for young people.
Phil-Ann, thank you so much for sharing that direct experience. And I think it really exemplifies in such a tangible way when you think about the code talkers and you think about the ways in which you're bridging across divides, geographies, and opportunities, as you said. It really exemplifies the vision of the National Service Civic Engagement and Volunteering pillar of the partnership, which is that a year of national service for all young adults should become a new rite of passage and common expectation in our country, and that this kind of commitment to service will unite people in just the way that you've experienced and you exemplify. So thank you for sharing that. Next, we're going to hear from our friend Nick Penniman, who is going to speak to us about effective governance and fair representation.
Thank you so much, Eric. So I am so pleased to be here today representing a large, busy community of organizations who work tirelessly to strengthen the systems that support our democracy. Think of such systems as the plumbing and electricity running through your house, so essential yet so often taken for granted until something breaks. Right now, many of our systems are breaking down. So what exactly do we work on? Number one, redistricting. Why? Because of gerrymandering, only 10% of seats in the House of Representatives are competitive today. That means that 90% of House candidates try to run towards the wings of their parties who vote in the primaries. If you care about political polarization and voting discrimination, you gotta care about gerrymandering. Now that the 2020 census numbers are set, the fight for fair, nonpartisan redistricts is on. Number two, money in politics. Why? Because wealthy special interests too often dominate policymaking in Congress, and too many politicians spend way too much money raising money. Many bills, most of them bipartisan, exist to create greater transparency of dark money, strengthen the Federal Election Commission, and pioneer new systems for funding politics in America. They deserve action now. Number three, voting. Why? Well, because despite the record turnout in last year's elections, America still lags behind 20 other countries when it comes to voter turnout rates. Just in the last 6 months, there have been multiple successful attempts to negatively alter voting in key states, including placing election administration under greater partisan control. Additionally, election infrastructure is drastically underfunded in most states. Congress needs to chip in more on behalf of funding its own elections and pass a refreshed John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, especially given today's Supreme Court decision. In terms of ripe opportunities at the state level, dozens of efforts are already underway to advance voting innovations like ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries at the state level. Number 4, congressional reform. Why? Because Congress is like a manufacturing plant that hasn't been upgraded in about 30 years. As a result, it struggles with its own internal democracy, with staff retention and establishing predictable and reliable flows of work. The Bipartisan Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress in the House has already advanced more than 100 ideas about how to improve the functioning of the House, and nearly all of those have been unanimously approved. The work must continue, and a similar effort should be propped up in the Senate. Believe it or not, that's just a sampling of what we all work on. Many of these solutions are contained in the For the People Act, also known as H.R. 1, which is before Congress as we speak. That bill was constructed by Democrats to set the table for a bold conversation about political systems reform. Now it's time for Republicans in Congress to bring their own ideas to the table so that we can have a great debate, begin fixing the plumbing and electricity together, and secure our democracy for the future. So back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Nick. And we're awash in metaphors here, whether plumbing or gardening or pillars. But I think whatever metaphor you choose, we can all agree that bridge building matters. And so Manu Meal, I'm going to turn it over to you to speak about this aspect of the partnership's work.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I would just like to say that in the spirit of partnership, I'm in our partner organization, American Promises offices. So if you guys hear background noise, that's the work of democracy. That's what we're going to chalk that up to. I want to make this really concrete. 4 years ago, 2017 is when I was a freshman at UC Berkeley. I graduated in May 2020 with some of my best friends. And within those 4 years, the first moment I stepped on campus, there were these huge protests because a speaker was on campus. And as the case is, young people often lead movements, whether it's for social change, for dialogue, for engagement. At that moment, there were these huge bouts of violence because young people felt so hopeless, so pessimistic, both about our state of democracy, but about the state of dialogue. And one of the things that one of the earlier speakers said was democracy works as long as we put something into it. And on that day, what people put into it was hopelessness and pessimism. And that goes against what most people achieve and aspire for. Most people want, agreement over disunion. Most people want courage over contempt. Most people just want politics to work. They want democracy to work. They want things to function. And the fact is that this pillar believes that democracy is about people. A lot of the other pillars are focused on reforms. A lot of the other pillars are focused on media. Each of these are an equal and important part. And our work is focused on how do we make the people in our democracy, the folks that actually vote at the ballot box, the folks that advocate for change, how do we help them be more empathetic, more constructive, more engaged? And the work of this pillar is built on equipping those people with skills, with opportunities, with passion, with conviction to help us actually bridge our divides. And the fact is that I stand on some really tall shoulders because I'm only here because of the folks that have trailblazed the bridge building field before me. This work started 4 years ago with 350 organizations coalescing into the Listen First Coalition. Since then, they've taken collective action. A lot of things that I said at the beginning, you might think they're hokey pokey stuff, but the fact is, here's some cold hard facts. When they coalesced, Eric, since then, we've had 4 huge events every year called the National Week of Conversation. 2 weeks ago, it started with this initiative called America Talks. Collectively, those initiatives have reached 30 million people on social media and have engaged thousands of folks across the country. What that tells me is that people want a democracy that works. The question is, what are we doing to put it in the mainstream? And that brings me to my work, which is how do we get young people out there? How do we get young people engaged? Democracy is at a turning point. It's a moment where a lot of people are asking, what can they do? Or how can they disengage because they're just tired of it? But one of the things that Mr. Gephardt said in the last segment was, we're here because this country allows us to be here, in the sense that the opportunities exist because the institutions are there to support us. And so I am so grateful to be representing this pillar's work, and I'm grateful to all of you. for the work that you're doing. And my job is to hitch along and do whatever I can to help young people get engaged. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Manu. And, that work of really not only recommitment, but rehumanization of our civic life centers around the kinds of stories we tell about who we are and who gets to be the we in the stories that we tell. And this brings us to the final pillar of work, which is really about revitalizing local journalism. And Frank, and combating disinformation. Frank, I want to turn it over to you to speak about that pillar's work.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and to everybody else. It's a thrill and a privilege and a pleasure to be here, and something that we're all doing because we believe in this. Our pillar, combating mis and disinformation, strengthening journalism, especially at the local level, we say flat out that we're going to work to restore and strengthen this, to build trust, to combat disinformation, to expand media literacy. And why? Because it's so important. It really is the bedrock of everything else we've been talking about here, of an informed and engaged citizenry. I'm going to do what reporters do. I'll tell a story, but a very short one, I promised. My first job as a reporter was in a little town. I heard about a guy who was selling himself as a family photographer. He'd set up a studio in a Howard Johnson's, if you remember that, just off the interstate, pitching young couples with little kids. Come on, let me take your picture. They did that. They gave him his money, and they get their money, and then they never got anything in return. I heard about it, talked to everybody, checked the guy out, discovered a track record of fraud. I spoke with local law enforcement about the whole thing. Went on the air. We shut him down. What happened? The community responded with genuine appreciation. I mean, remember, this is a little town. I wasn't a reporter. I was a neighbor, an ally, an advocate for the community, a trusted source of credible and vital information. It's a tiny example, and it's not about politics, I know, and deliberately, and it's a long time ago, but it's something we need more of. So much has changed since then. That station doesn't even do local news anymore. Local journalism has been downsized every place because the business model of journalism has imploded. The audience has changed. Mis and disinformation are rampant. Trust in the media is the casualty of all this, as we know so well. And now we have instead, bubbles that we hear and see, and alternate universes of information that divide us instead of unite us. What can we do about it? We actually can do a lot of things. And that's what this pillar is going to be looking at. And we invite you and hope that a lot of people will join us in this because we can make a difference. One, recognize that the starting place for journalism really is in the places where we live and work and learn. Promote more and new kinds of funding sources for that local journalism. It exists. Places like the Texas Tribune and the Salt Lake City Tribune, not related, are nonprofits now and doing powerful local important journalism. We can reward public media that's funded by and invests in the community. You hear it all the time. Members are part of that. We can elevate campaigns to fight mis and disinformation, the research behind it, and the ways to push back. We can pass a shield law to protect professional journalists, yes, at the local level, who are trying to do their jobs, sometimes in delicate situations where they're holding people in power to account for the benefit of the public and the public good. We can promote media literacy. We talk about that a lot, so that news consumers can be informed consumers and recognize credible and independent information when they see it and sort that out from stuff that doesn't make that cut. We can support storytelling from people and places that have been overlooked in this country in the way that Deborah and James Fallows do with our Towns project. It's brilliant. We can be outspoken advocates for fact, truth, and accountability that includes holding media accountable for the work that they do. We have talked a lot about these pillars. We've got to work across and among pillars. Maybe pillars really isn't the right word here, because we can't build bridges without people sharing some common information. We can't improve our civics without people having a base of fact and history from which to draw. So we can do these. I hope that you will join this pillar and others, whatever we call them, and join the movement and be part of the partnership, because that's the important word for American democracy here. As far as I'm concerned, in this space, we can have journalism that informs, engages, and benefits our communities and our country. And I thank you very much. And Eric, back over to you.
Frank, thank you so much for that impassioned call. And I just want to close out this session by noting what the simple thread is across all of the work that we've talked about here: civic learning, national service, effective governance, bridge building, reimagining local journalism, and combating disinformation. The through line here is a single word, and it's central to our work at Citizen University: responsibility, responsibility taking. We are a country centered on rights, but rights properly understood are responsibilities. And our work together as a partnership means taking on ownership of what it takes to sustain and to keep our republic. I'm so excited to be joining in this work with all of you in this conversation today and all of the many hundreds who've joined this launch today. Thank you, and we really look forward to next steps together.
Hi, I'm Daniela Ballou-Ayres, CEO and co-founder of the Leadership Now Project, an organization of business and thought leaders committed to renewing American democracy. I co-founded Leadership Now in 2017 with a group of fellow Harvard Business School alumni who were concerned about the future of American democracy. Today, we're a membership organization across the country who draw MBA alumni into the efforts to both restore and protect our nation's system. I'm joined today by two extraordinary leaders who've shown what business leadership in democracy looks like. Kent Thiry is a former CEO of a Fortune 500 company for nearly 20 years, based in Colorado at DaVita. His leadership was instrumental in efforts like Fair Maps Colorado and Colorado Votes. Natalie Tran is the executive director of CAA Foundation and also instrumental in forming the Civic Alliance efforts to promote voting and democracy across thousands of American companies. We heard earlier today that we're an inflection point for our democracy, and I think we're similarly at an inflection point for the role that business plays in protecting and renewing it. And before I jump into the conversation with our panelists, I wanted to say a few words about what we've seen over the last year, because it's been a really unique mobilization of American business in support of our system. And the question for all of us now is, will that grow and sustain? So if we look back to last year, we saw thousands of companies play a significant role in offering time off for voting, enabling their employees to be poll workers, and providing critical messaging and information to voters and employees about how to vote under COVID safely and effectively. And I think really that played a meaningful role in the dramatic turnout we saw in the 2020 election. As we approached the election, business leaders were also part of sounding the alarm about the risks that this election may not be seen as legitimate and the importance of a safe and fair election. Immediately after the election, we saw business uniformly, from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the Business Roundtable to many individual business leaders, recognize the legitimacy of the results. And finally, in January, when there was an insurrection at the Capitol, business was also uniform, from the National Manufacturers Association, again, to industry associations across the country, in condemning that violence. And dozens of Fortune 500 companies committed to no longer fund or to pause funding for members of Congress who were election objectors. And in recent months, we have similarly seen business leaders step up when voting rights were challenged in states like Georgia and Texas. So there's been a trajectory here which is encouraging, but of course, many risks ahead. And the question for us is, will that leadership endure and grow in partnership with all of the organizations and leaders we've heard from today? So I'd love to kick it over to you, Kent. You've really, in a very deliberate and effective way, been part of efforts to strengthen democracy in Colorado. And would love to hear more about that experience and what you think it means for other leaders and their engagement.
Okay, thanks, Daniela. And it's an honor to be here with everybody in this cause. Just very quickly, we've won 5 initiatives in Colorado, 4 of them bright fastballs down the middle in terms of good government, things like gerrymandering reform at the federal level, at the state level, opening up primaries, et cetera. Equally significant is with 4 of the 5 we were expected to lose, and 3 of the 4 by a lot. And in all cases, we were expected to get a small minority of Republican voters. Instead, in 4 out of the 5, we actually got a majority of Republican voters, proving that those voters are not as polarized as elected officials might suggest. 8 quick tips for getting business involved and winning, because in the end, this is about winning, not diagnosing. Number 1, the tripartisan coalitions, D's, R's, and I's. Number 2, we did Noah's Ark. Every time you brought me a Democrat, you had to follow up next by bringing a Republican, because if you get too many of one, it starts to take on that taint and it's harder to recruit the other. Number 3, adequate funding. Business understands this. You don't start a business with $1,000. A business has to be capitalized proportionate to the business plan. Adequate funding, number 3. Number 4, data-driven messaging and segmentation. Business leaders and in general, connoisseurs of the craft of campaigning do not want to hear a lot about your intuition and your sense of the voter. Well-run campaigns are data-driven in messaging, data-driven in segmentation. Number 5, an equal emphasis on grass tops as grassroots in the media. Number 6, get people from all parts of the political spectrum to be co-architects of the policy itself. No substitute for that. Number 7, be selective on funding. Again, it's really a big deal to get a major Republican funder to take your side or a major Democratic funder, because that speaks with about triple volume to the parties themselves. And lastly, number 8, hire professionals, hire the best. Do not rely on your natural ability.
Thank you, Kent. I think that's really sage guidance for everyone who wants to play a leading role in these efforts. Natalie, over to you. Can you share what it really took to mobilize an extraordinary coalition of businesses on voting and democracy around this last election?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think the lead up to last year's election was so unique, from the pandemic to the racial justice movement and world events. I think there's also a rising expectation from younger generations that companies really need to stand for something, coupled with the fact that employees also want to be able to bring their authentic selves to the workplace now. All of this created an environment where companies were not only invited, but really expected to showcase their values and take action, even if they had never done it before. So in late January of last year, the CA Foundation and Democracy Works launched the Civic Alliance with the hope that businesses could come together to support safe, accessible, and trusted elections. We were really intentional about creating a low barrier for entry, meaning we wanted to make it as easy as possible for companies to not only join us, but engage in really meaningful ways. There's no fee to join the Civic Alliance, and membership includes an entire library of resources, including seminars and toolkits, an incredible network. To date, more than 1,300 companies have joined from a wide range of industries, from Coca-Cola, Airbnb, Starbucks, Levi's, and McDonald's, and so on. So many of our members really led the way last year. For example, Best Buy shortened its operating hours on election day, so store employees had the time they needed to cast a ballot in person. Old Navy offered to pay its 50,000 employees to serve as poll workers. H&M turned every one of their physical store locations in the US into voter registration centers. I mean, I'd be here all day if I went through the entire list of examples, but I think it's truly the combination of all of these efforts that made 2020 the tipping point for corporate civics. And I think the way that we get more organizations engaged is we just have to keep the momentum going. We want last year to be the beginning, not the end of corporate engagement in civics. We have a really incredible foundation now, so I think we just need to build on that. You know, we have so many case studies from nearly every industry of how companies can engage, best practices to share, and this incredible network. We're really working to help our member companies institutionalize all of the activity we saw last year. And one of the key ways I think we can do that is by creating venues for continued learning and collaborations across all sectors. That is why I think the work of the Partnership for American Democracy is so important. And I'm really thrilled that the Civic Alliance could be a part of this terrific network.
Fantastic. So before we go, I want to hear a bit from both of you about what you think is next. What is it going to take for business to continue to lead and grow? And how can business engage on some topics that, while we all here may argue are not controversial about democracy and the goals of this partnership, sometimes can get uncomfortable and might require leaders to be out in front and not just wait to join on? Kent, maybe over to you.
I would first say, don't underestimate the challenge. And again, I'll try to speak in staccato shorthand so we get as much information as we can in a small period of time. Don't underestimate the challenge. There's an awful lot of reasons why a CEO will lean against taking a demonstrable stand or getting engaged. Number two, they also experience this cause as a cottage industry, subscale, whole lot of organizations, undercapitalized, hand to mouth, not a real strategy, not strong track records. And so they look at that cottage industry, and it does not look like necessarily a train worth hitching your wagon to. And so we need to combat those perceptions, both substantively and perceptually. And so things like conveying to them how useful and applicable their skills are in terms of strategy, project management, analysis, et cetera, how useful those skills are, how cross-applicable they are. Number two, they often underestimate their convening ability, that they can be the force that brings D's, R's, I's, NGOs, et cetera, together. They can, in the real world, do that. And nobody better at recruiting business people than business people. And then third, the messaging. So often the do-gooder groups that are wonderfully smart and aspirational and intelligent and sincere go in and they just overdiagnose the problem, which everybody's already heard. And then they talk about prescription in a high-level way, and then they wait for the money to roll in. When in fact, the CEO is sitting there saying, where's the strategy? Where's the management process? How disciplined will it be? How good is the talent? So give me about 5 minutes on diagnosis and prescription, but the rest on how you're going to win and how my skills and talents and resources might be applicable. And then the last thing I'll say is bottoms up. When you're a CEO and if in every town hall that you have and on the chat rooms around your company, more and more of your people are saying, why aren't we doing more about saving America's democracy? That is as powerful almost as if they go home and at the dinner table, their 16-year-old daughter says the same thing. So use bottoms up pressure. CEOs feel that acutely in today's world.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I'll just sort of piggyback with a couple of examples from the Civic Alliance. You know, one of a learning from last year was that strength in numbers and providing a platform to be seen are really powerful tactics to engage leaders. We launched a challenge called 100% in for democracy, which is an opportunity for companies to show how they were taking real concrete steps to strengthen our democracy, some of which I just shared in the examples earlier. And in a truly historic move, we had over 650 company member CEOs join us. We had full page ads in the New York Times and the USA Today. We had a bunch of buzz on social media. The millions of employees all across the company saw their company taking action. And the public saw that corporate America was in support of a healthy democracy. But I'll also just add, I think this kind of movement is hard if it's 5 or even just 10 companies. But when you have hundreds of companies making this kind of commitment, it becomes really hard to ignore. It also signaled to other companies that engaging in civics is no longer an option. It's actually mission critical. And I think this work is truly for everyone, meaning each company has their own unique superpower, no matter their size. We're so proud to have hundreds of small to mid-sized businesses who are part of our network. You know, a company with a large national footprint could get behind a really large poll worker campaign, but a local coffee shop who happens to be the most influential business in that small town might engage on election day, which increases voter turnout. And so that can be just as impactful. And I think the work at the Civic Alliance is about creating a strong environment where companies can take that first step, then provide them with the tools and resources they need to engage further in really deeply innovative ways, not alone, but with an incredible cohort of peers. So I think we just need to keep the pressure on. And if we can keep pushing forward and we do it all together, this movement not only continues, but it grows. So I'm hopeful and optimistic.
Fantastic. Well, I think we certainly need energy and optimism to tackle the challenges ahead. I do believe business can be part of that, while also recognizing that business needs to be very self-reflective, I think, about how it can use its influence and resources in the system. Recognizing business actors sometimes have been on the sidelines when democracy is threatened, and other times have shown great leadership, and that's played out around the world, not only in the US. So I really am thrilled to have the opportunity to speak with these leaders, to speak with everyone on the line about what the future looks like, not only for business leadership, but for business working in partnership with all the actors that we see in this coalition. I think the work ahead is too important for any of us to be on the sidelines, and I look forward to that collaboration in the year ahead. So thank you to the partnership.
Thank you.
And now we welcome Tim Shriver to close the event.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Daniela and Kent and Natalie. It is This has been an extraordinary hour and a half, maybe a little bit more. I know we've run over a little bit, but we appreciate your waiting and joining us for this ultimate panel, the reunion of the West Wing tribe, people who have sat at the center of American democracy, the presidency of the United States, who have sat not just there, but at community levels and in schools and community centers around the country and done the work from the bottom up at the same time. It is an extraordinary honor to be able to, in part, have this sort of miniature West Wing reunion, but also to shift the conversation from what we don't want to what we do want. What are the steps that are necessary now, not just to critique the problems of American democracy, but to build the new American democracy, to create with this partnership the possibilities in the future. Let me begin by welcoming Cecilia Munoz. Cecilia, you served for 8 years for a president whose primary brand was hope, whose primary message to the country from the time he ran, in some ways straight through the complete presidency, was the idea that we could hope again in America, that hope and awakening were possible. Why do you see this moment as important and this partnership as being critical?
Well, thank you so much, Tim. I mean, I'm the daughter of immigrants from a country where democracy was pretty precarious and is pretty precarious, and was raised sort of with the understanding and expectation that democracy would be strong in this country. And I witnessed it, as we all have, and participated it, and worked for a president that was really thinking about and acting on bringing us all together. And all of that gives me great hope. I've seen what we were capable of doing. But it's also true that, and I feel like I've personally learned in new ways that it really does fall to every generation to preserve democracy, to strengthen our democracy. And that is our job now. And there are ways in which it is at risk. And I worry about those, but I also know that this is a country which has remade itself, which has recognized ways in which we have strayed from our ideals and values. We know how to do that. We're capable of doing that. And that's our job. That's how we protect democracy. And I'm a deep believer in our capacity to do that.
Beautiful. Thanks, Cecilia. Melody, you've also served that same president, President Obama. You've served in so many roles throughout your storied career, now in a teaching role at the University of Virginia. And a lot of what's come up on this conversation is that Americans seem not to understand democracy, don't understand the workings of the government, the mechanisms of the Constitution, the ways in which we change. How do you see what it's going to take to create for this new era an educated populace that can, in a sense, own, claim, and protect democracy?
Well, thank you, Tim, for that question. And it's such a pleasure to be here with Bridge and to be with Cecilia, people who I admire and have enjoyed working with over the years. And you're right, at the University of Virginia, we are heavily focused on the question that you pose. One of the things that I believe is so important about universities and about education in general is that universities are predicated on the idea of data, facts, knowledge, open debate. And people dispute that, they argue about it, but those are foundational elements to a university, but they're also elemental to democracy itself. They're Enlightenment ideas. And the Enlightenment obviously helped to usher in American democracy with its challenges, but certainly with its great opportunities. And we believe that a university has a critical role to play in helping to not only educate students who matriculate through that university. It is the idea behind the University of Virginia that was created at the time that the nation was new. It was 1819, and the idea that citizen leaders across disciplines had to be nurtured. But in addition to that, the ways that universities can, should, and must engage with the broader community, both local and national and international, to learn, to work with practitioners, to work with people across sectors, to take on the big challenges in front of us. So we recently launched the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia to do just that kind of work, and think about it modeled in many ways on what's happened at universities in the past. So you think about Howard University Law School, and the role that law school played in the desegregation of America's schools. The very legal ideas and arguments that became part of Brown versus Board of Education and other important cases were hashed out in those halls and among those who were teaching there, who were deans, who had matriculated there. So universities have that critical role to play. And we believe that's important, not only in terms of an honest recitation and understanding of our history, of an analysis of American democracy, a debate about that, a rigorous debate about that, but all of that then animates action in the same way they did at Howard University Law School, at the same way they've done at other universities across the country, so that we in fact can have impact. So it's education, it's debate, it's rigor, but it's also about impact.
Beautiful. It's another great history lesson. I hadn't put the two and two together of the history of the Howard University Law School and Justice Marshall and others who were associated with it, but nurturing the ideas that would come to transform the democracy, transform the law of the land, transform the culture, our practices. Beautifully shared. Thank you, Melody, for that. I have to say, if you were going to invite guest speakers to the new Karsh Center, your predecessor on this call, Cecilia Munoz, and the person about to follow you, John Bridgeland, I can't imagine two better speakers, people who, like you, served in the Domestic Policy Council. But let's go over to you, Bridge. If you're not preparing a speech at UVA or not trying to change the world around COVID, which you've done so brilliantly with the COVID Collaborative, you've been working on these issues. You've been bridging gaps. I've been trying to follow you and understand from you and learn from you the ways in which to renew our democracy. You've done it with COVID. How do you think about democracy and our ability to solve public problems today?
Well, let me just say it's wonderful to be with three of my favorite people. And Mel, no pressure. You don't have to have us as speakers.
I've been inviting both of you. So I want you to come.
I'm your speaking agent.
But I was actually compelled by what Doris Kearns-Goodwin said earlier. It was just such a powerful reminder. Something like history tells us that transforming change comes from the ground up, from citizens taking action. And that's, I think, why I like the Partnership for American Democracy so much. You know, America is such a big country dripping with talent. And I've just been watching the chat light up the whole program with all these extraordinary people and institutions and leaders. I also liked, remember we talk about the 250th anniversary. Mortimer Adler wrote a little book called We Hold These Truths in celebration of the bicentennial. And he said the highest office isn't president, isn't Supreme Court justice, isn't senator. It's citizen. And so I think the question for the partnership is how do we tap the genius of the nation, all this extraordinary talent to renew, reinvent, re-envision our democracy. You know, every enterprise in the country does a kind of an upgrade. We ought to upgrade American democracy. And so I'm really thrilled to be working with all of you and all these extraordinary people across the country on something concrete, sustainable democracy goals that will be well defined with clear goals, plans to meet them, quality implementation, accountability for results that, you know, we all have worked together across administrations. But we need initiatives that are at least decadal, that transcend politics in periods of time. And so one of the things, Governor Kempthorne and Patrick talked so eloquently about the COVID Collaborative, taking on the nation's #1 crisis, bringing people together across very different politics, faiths, competencies, health, education, and the economy. And when pandemic hits federalism with 56 inhabited states and territories, 3,000 counties, 31,000 zip codes and 326 tribal lands, you actually need a whole country response, and democracy requires a whole country response. So I'm actually excited to highlight today that Americans are desperate for platforms for shared work to solve public challenges, and there are not enough of them that, like the partnership, that's kind of a common flotilla of action. And so we went back and studied, Tim and Andrew and all of us, what were the breakthrough initiatives across American history, from the Constitutional Convention to the National Park System to the Civil Rights Movement, and what were the elements of the secret sauce that made those things possible? And so the four of us will be launching in September the Office of American Possibilities that will, harness and tap the ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit and creativity of the American people, their leaders, their institutions, to make common cause across politics and all our differences to affect change. It won't be easy, but my experience is after 9/11, Bob Dole called me and said, more work, fewer words. And I never forgot that, because when Americans engaged in shared work, all of a sudden the stigmatizing, the othering, the labels of political party dissipate. And we look at what we're achieving to help the country. Bill Buckley said every person wants democratic citizenship, beckons us to be a king. Republican citizenship invites everyone to be a knight. And I think at some level, we all, ordinary Americans, want to do extraordinary things, to have their scratch on history. And I'm just so excited to be working with Mel and Cecilia and team and a whole group of people and institutions to unleash not only the partnership, but this Office of American Possibilities that sort of becomes the bigness of our country. So yes, thank you.
Thanks, Bridge. So very exciting. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, I realized, but it's too late for introductions on these things. But this work, Bridge, that you've talked about, what we've sometimes called the starving majority of Americans looking for an opportunity to change the course of the future. They don't like where we are. They don't know what to do or how to change it, but they're desperate for the chance. The partnership is one such chance right now. We need folks, I think the message here is we need folks to join. We need folks to be in the game. We need folks, organizations, average citizens, that holder of the great high office of citizen, to join together so that people like Bruce Reed, who helped start this off, like Doris Kearns Goodwin, who helped us to see the historic flow of these ideas, so that they, together with all of us, can begin to imagine. This is the great, I think, gift of a democracy, is we get to imagine something different, right? So just in the last minute we've got here, I know we're over time, but I just want to give each of you a chance, if you want, to share maybe just one thing that gives you hope right now. Maybe it's something from your career, something you did when you were in the White House, or maybe it's something today. Is there a specific example that, when your heart beats a little stronger, a little faster, you think of this and you think to yourself, we can do this? Cecilia?
Think of the way that people are coming together around this crisis that we're living through right now. We hear a lot about people's differences with respect to the way they're responding to the crisis. But I'll tell you what, in my neighborhood, people are gathering food every week and delivering it, because we know we have neighbors who don't have enough because of the economic downturn. And it's very direct, and it's very human to human, and we don't necessarily know each other's political views. And I'm grateful for that, because we know there's hunger in our community. And so people are coming together to address it. And that is the kind of thing which gives me hope.
Beautiful, beautiful. Small acts are big and great acts. I thank you, Cecilia. Mel?
Yeah, I think about work that actually we've worked on together with young people who have been disengaged from education, maybe haven't finished high school, not gone to community college or connected to the labor market. And we worked on this when I was in the White House with a council that was across the ideological spectrum, across sectors. That work continues today. And it continues, I think, to Cecilia's point, in local communities, each one focused on what the problem looks like there, helping these young people commit to pathways, working with them and respecting and understanding the leadership capabilities of those young people, their commitment to their country, their hunger to be a part of this country, to vote, to participate, and watching these young people, these young adults, be successful in that way. And now meeting their families, hearing about the jobs that they have, the degrees that they've been able to complete. That's work that brought government and the private sector and the nonprofit sector and the philanthropic sector and people at all levels of government and across party lines together to do something that is literally making the difference in lives of millions of young people. And again, with young people at the center of that design. So I think that speaks to the future and speaks to the way that we can work together collaboratively.
Beautiful, beautiful. Bridge?
I just say, you know, one unexpected, America is just such a compassionate nation. And for 15 to 20 years, I've had the privilege of working on trying to save lives from those who are dying from a preventable and treatable disease called malaria in Africa. And there's no domestic constituency in the United States. We eliminated malaria in the 1950s, early 60s, but it's killing 1.2 million, mostly children under 5 and mothers. And yet Americans mobilized a President's Malaria Initiative, Boys and Girls Clubs and churches and mosques and where, you know, people were marching in the street to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for malaria bed nets to protect families from malaria. And so I always think on every issue we work on, what's the malaria bed net? What's that wedge that can help move a country, move a world? And that's just the bigness of America, to do something where it has no particular direct interest, and yet, you know, our resources, our people, our technology are saving millions of lives. In that case, 7 million lives in the last 15 years. That gives me hope.
What an honor to be with the three of you. What an honor to have been a part of this classroom for American democracy, this refresher course for American democracy. And I would dare say, you know, when we've done this polling, I know you've all seen this, that Americans don't like the story we're telling ourselves today. But you can't change a story without a new one. And if I've learned anything in the last 90 minutes, it's that this is our moment, that history is calling us, that our communities are calling us, that this moment is calling us. Every generation has its moment. And maybe it is not in the bright spotlight of political action always, or on the largest stages of human endeavor, but maybe on the small personal stages of human endeavor, when each of us hears the call. This moment is calling, the country is calling. We have been called. And I dare say to each of you with us, you have been asked, you have been invited, you have been called. This democracy is at risk. This story needs an update. This is our chance to work together in very concrete and very practical and very specific and very urgent ways. Not to protect the past, but to build a new future. And it is a great honor for all of us to be involved. Thanks everyone for joining. Stay tuned for more in the days and weeks and months ahead on the Partnership for American Democracy.